The old man hit the sand with a grunt as the crowd above roared in savage laughter. Chains rattled around his wrists, his knees creaked, and for a moment it looked like he might simply collapse and let them jeer him to death. A drunken mercenary shouted that the galaxy had finally grown tired of antiques, and another tossed a rusted helmet at his feet like an offering to mock a soldier long past his prime. The arena lights blazed down with pitiless heat, bathing the ring in gold and blood, and every eye watched the pathetic relic of a war no one even bothered to remember. Yet the old man smiled, lips curling around yellow teeth, as if the joke was on them. Slowly, almost lazily, he reached up to the black patch covering his left eye. The crowd fell quieter, leaning forward, sensing the weight of something unsaid. With a snap of leather, the patch came away. His left eye gleamed with a cold, unnatural light. Gasps rippled like shockwaves through the crowd. The whispers began, "Reaper." He had once been called a ghost in the cockpit, the kind of man who could thread a fighter through asteroid belts without so much as a scratch. In the Orion Wars, his name had been painted across enemy walls in blood and warning. But now, here he was, bent-backed, bones creaking, facing down 6 mercenaries built like armored beasts. They sneered at him, their tattoos glowing neon under the floodlights, their rifles slung casually as though he were less than a warm-up fight. One spat in the sand near his boots and said the galaxy was done with legends. Reaper tilted his head, his cybernetic eye humming faintly. The mercenary's sneer faltered. The arena master raised a hand from his throne of steel and circuitry, signaling the match's beginning. The chains fell loose with a hiss, and the mercenaries tightened their grips on their weapons. The old man rolled his shoulders, bones popping like fireworks, and muttered something that made the nearest merc laugh out loud. None of the audience caught the words, but they carried a certain calm, the kind of calm you only hear from a man who has killed so often that fear had long ago packed up and left. The first merc charged, axe swinging down with enough force to split concrete. The old man sidestepped with the smallest shift of his weight, the axe slamming into the sand. Before the merc could wrench it free, the old man's hand snapped out, 2 fingers striking a nerve cluster in the merc's neck. The giant froze, went stiff as a statue, and toppled forward face first into the dirt. The crowd howled in surprise, some in laughter, others in shock. The old man sighed, dusted his palms, and said in a voice too casual for the moment, "I hope you brought more than axes." The next 2 came together, one with a plasma whip, the other with twin blades sparking with energy. They circled him, predators toying with prey. But the prey was smiling again. He raised his hand to the cybernetic eye, and a thin red beam scanned the arena floor. The whip cracked toward him, and he simply bent at the waist with creaky grace, letting it hiss past his head. In the same motion, the beam locked onto the blade wielder. A pulse of invisible energy shot out. The blades flickered, fizzled, then died in the man's hands. He stared down, horrified, as the old man stepped in and drove a fist into his gut with all the force of a plasma grenade. The merc collapsed, air and bile spilling from him, while the whip user froze in disbelief. It would have been funny if it weren't so bloody. The old man patted his own chest, coughed, and muttered something about his heart not being what it used to be. The crowd erupted in laughter this time, drawn into the absurdity of it all. The whip cracked again, but this time the old man caught it. Sparks flew as the whip wrapped around his arm, burning into his skin. He didn't flinch. Instead, he yanked, pulling the merc clean off his feet and into the sand. A boot to the man's head ended that fight with a sickening crunch. 3 down, 3 left. Their grins were gone now. Their eyes darted to one another, doubt spreading like a disease. The old man rotated his neck, vertebrae popping, then gave them the look of a grandfather deciding which grandchild had earned a slap upside the head. The cybernetic eye glowed brighter, casting a faint crimson haze over the arena. He looked less like a broken veteran and more like the myth children whispered about, the nightmare pilots prayed would never find them in the cold black of space. Another merc came screaming, this one with a rotary blaster strapped to his arm. He sprayed the sand in a storm of energy bolts. The crowd screamed, choking on dust and ozone. When it cleared, the old man wasn't there. He was behind the merc, one hand gripping the man's throat. How he had crossed that distance, no one could say. Perhaps he had never been in front at all. With a twist, the merc's neck broke like a snapped branch, his body crumpling beneath its own weight. The blaster arm sputtered and died. The crowd went silent for the first time that night. The last two mercs backed away, their bravado gone, their eyes wide. They whispered to each other, their voices trembling. The old man tapped his temple with one finger, cybernetic eye glowing like a dying star. He didn't need to speak. They knew. They charged anyway, desperation stronger than sense. It ended quickly, brutally. A knee shattered, a throat collapsed, and silence fell across the arena. The old man stood alone in the sand, chest rising and falling, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of the lights. Then he bent, picked up the rusted helmet the mercenaries had mocked him with, and placed it gently on one of the corpses. He turned to the audience, lips curling into the same smile he had worn at the start. The whispers swelled into shouts, chants, roars. Reaper! 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 The arena master leaned forward in his throne, eyes alight with greed and fear, and the old man simply adjusted the strap of his patch before sliding it back over his glowing eye. The galaxy had thought him gone. It was wrong. The arena still trembled with echoes of the chant long after the mercenaries' bodies had been dragged away. Reaper stood at the center of the sand, breathing steady, as if the slaughter he had just performed were nothing more than stretching before breakfast. The crowd did not know whether to cheer louder or shrink back in fear. The name they had shouted was a ghost, a legend from wars many of them had only read about in half-forgotten archives. Yet there he was, flesh and bone, cracked joints and scars, staring at them with the single glowing eye that had haunted history. He did not speak. He let silence work harder than words ever could, and the silence pressed on the crowd until it grew unbearable. Somewhere, someone muttered a prayer. Someone else cursed their luck for buying a ticket to see an old man die, only to watch the birth of terror instead. Inside Reaper's mind, the roar of the crowd faded and another roar replaced it, the roar of engines burning in the void. He remembered the cockpit of the Scythe, his fighter during the Orion Wars. Metal wrapped around him like a coffin, but the view ahead was always endless. He could feel the vibrations of the reactor through the soles of his boots, smell the tang of ozone from the oxygen recyclers, hear the distant chatter of his squad in his comms. He had been younger then, sharp as a blade, reckless enough to laugh in the face of orbital cannons. The Orion fleet had called him a curse, a shadow that slipped through their defenses. Every kill he made was another story whispered around their barracks fires. The one-eyed wolf, the angel of the black. Call him whatever they wanted. He had been Reaper, and every enemy knew the sound of his approach meant someone was not coming home. The memories did not come in order. They came like the flash of gunfire across a battlefield, sudden, violent, leaving the echo of screams. He remembered one mission above the moons of Ganira, where he had flown his fighter through debris fields so thick it was like threading a needle through shattered glass. His wingmen had begged him to fall back, but he had pressed forward, single-handedly destroying a destroyer-class cruiser from the inside out. It had been madness, and it had been beautiful. The galaxy had thought no one would survive that run. Reaper had not only survived, he had walked away with a smile, covered in ash and victory. But victory always had a cost, and those costs came back to him now. The Orion Wars had not ended with banners and songs. They had ended with betrayal. The men who had sung his praises had decided he was too dangerous to live. His eye, the very tool that had turned battles into legends, had been declared illegal, too unstable, too powerful for peace. He remembered the day it all collapsed. His own commanders had sent him into a trap, a mission that was supposed to erase him quietly. He had fought his way out, lost half his squad, and taken a blast to the side of his face that left his eye a mangled ruin. That should have been the end of him. The official reports even said it was. But he had survived, patched together by the same underground engineers who had first built his cursed eye. They saved his life, but they saved it in silence. He vanished, and the galaxy celebrated his death as a step toward peace. The crowd's chanting pulled him back to the present. They had no idea they were staring at a ghost who never should have walked again. He looked at the arena walls, at the smug lords and gamblers who had thought today's entertainment would be an execution. He wondered if any of them realized how fragile their world was now. His reputation alone could shift the balance of power. Even rumors of his survival would shake governments and syndicates alike. Yet here they were, drinking, betting, laughing nervously as if they still had control. Reaper chuckled under his breath. The galaxy always forgot too quickly. It would remember soon enough. From the corner of the ring, the arena master rose from his throne. His long coat shimmered with embedded circuitry, his face hidden behind a mask of silver plates. He spread his arms theatrically, as if he had planned this spectacle all along. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, declaring the old man victorious, declaring him the champion of the night. The crowd roared again, and wagers changed hands with frantic energy. Some cursed at their losses, others celebrated, but all of them stared at the old man with something between awe and fear. The master smiled beneath his mask, though the smile was brittle. He had expected a quick fight, a novelty act, but now he had in his possession something far more valuable and far more dangerous than gold. He had a living legend inside his arena. Reaper ignored him. He crouched to pick up a handful of sand, letting the grains fall through his fingers. Each grain reminded him of a face lost, a battle fought, a promise broken. He had sworn never to fight again, never to become the weapon they had made him. Yet here he was, standing over the bodies of men who had underestimated him, standing in the spotlight of a galaxy that had forgotten. His chest tightened, not with fear but with the weight of inevitability. Peace had never been his gift. War followed him the way a shadow follows a flame. A boy in the stands caught his eye, not more than 12, his face pressed against the barrier. He was staring not with fear but with wide-eyed wonder. The same kind of wonder Reaper remembered feeling when he had first seen warships carve across the sky. It was the kind of look that made legends. The old man closed his good eye for a moment, almost in pain. The galaxy would eat that boy alive, just as it had eaten him, just as it had devoured every soldier before him. He wished the boy would look away, but the boy did not. The boy mouthed the word he had heard chanted moments before, Reaper. The mercenaries' blood still darkened the sand, and the stink of iron hung heavy in the air. The old man's joints ached, his body screamed for rest, but his mind was already calculating, always calculating. He could see the arena guards shifting nervously, the sponsors whispering to one another, the factions who would already be plotting. His return to the galaxy was not just survival. It was a declaration, whether he wanted it to be or not. Somewhere deep down, beneath scars and cynicism, he felt the old fire flicker again. He hated it, but he could not kill it. Not yet. The crowd would never know the truth of what they had seen. They thought they had watched an old man defy death for sport. What they had actually witnessed was the rebirth of something far more dangerous than they could imagine. The galaxy had forgotten Reaper, but forgetting would not save them. Tonight was not just a fight in the sand. Tonight was the spark that would reignite ghosts buried in the dark, and Reaper knew that the shadows of the Orion Wars had only just begun to stretch their fingers across the stars once more. The fight had been meant to amuse gamblers and feed the arena's blood-soaked sand. Instead, it had ignited the galaxy. Within hours of the broadcast, hollow feeds carried grainy images of the old man dispatching mercenaries like they were drunks stumbling in an alley. The feeds looped the moment when he tore off his patch and revealed the glowing eye. That moment traveled faster than light. Whole colonies that had never known his name before whispered it now. To some, it was myth returned. To others, it was nightmare reborn. Reaper was alive, and the galaxy reacted the only way it knew how, with fear, greed, and hunger for opportunity. The arena master had not expected to own something so volatile. He reclined in his metallic throne, his silver-plated mask reflecting the light of the arena's torches. Around him, the private balconies of warlords, syndicate bosses, and bureaucrats buzzed with conversation. They no longer spoke of wagers lost or mercenaries dead. They spoke of power. To hold Reaper, even briefly, was to hold a weapon. The master's hands drummed against his chair as he calculated the fortune he could demand from the factions that would soon be clamoring. His arena, once an entertainment pit, had become the stage on which empires would decide their future. Reaper knew all of this without hearing a single word. He had seen the looks, the greed dripping from their eyes. He could smell ambition the way a wolf smells blood. They had not dragged him into the sand to die. They had dragged him into the sand to test whether the rumors of his survival were true. Now that the galaxy knew, there was no going back to anonymity. He had always hated politics, the smug games of men in velvet robes who thought wars were pieces on a board. Yet every time his name surfaced, those games began again. He rubbed his face, weary, muttering that retirement had been so peaceful before some idiot had decided to drag him out for sport. That night, the master invited Reaper to his chambers, a space filled with the scent of burnt incense and the soft hum of surveillance drones. Guards flanked the walls, though their eyes avoided Reaper as if looking at him too long would curse them. The master spread his arms theatrically, his voice warm with the false hospitality of a man who thinks he controls the room. He spoke of opportunities, of alliances, of wagers placed by the most powerful seats of the galaxy. It was no longer just about fighting mercenaries. Now 2 factions had already sent word, demanding the old man's survival or his execution. His victory or his death would decide ownership of entire systems, wealth beyond measure, fleets waiting to be unleashed. The master called it destiny. Reaper called it a headache. Reaper listened in silence, his single glowing eye scanning the chamber. He did not need to ask which factions. He already knew. The Orion remnant, still nursing wounds from wars they lost, would see him as a threat that must be erased. The corporate dynasties, bloated on greed, would see him as a mascot of fear to parade for profit. Neither side wanted him alive on his own terms. Both sides wanted him as a pawn, dead or alive, but never free. He chuckled, the sound dry as gravel, and asked the master what he stood to gain from all this scheming. The man behind the mask smiled, speaking of riches and prestige. Reaper shook his head, almost pitying him. Men like that never understood that when you hold a wolf by the ears, you cannot simply let go. The next day the arenas filled again, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was no laughter, no jeering. The crowd was tense, aware that they were witnessing something far larger than a blood sport. Reaper walked into the sand unchained this time, his steps steady despite the weight of eyes watching. His opponents were not the usual mercenaries or desperate criminals. They were champions selected by the factions themselves, each a weapon crafted for spectacle. One was a hulking cyborg wrapped in armored plating, his spine fused with a rotary cannon. Another was a blade dancer from the outer moons, her body wired with reflex enhancers that made her move faster than the eye could follow. The third was something stranger, a genetically engineered predator with skin that shimmered like oil, moving on all fours with claws like razors. They did not come to win honor. They came to kill him and settle wagers across the stars. The announcer roared their names, his voice cracked with excitement, but the crowd stayed hushed. All attention was on the old man standing alone in the center. He rolled his shoulders, his joints popping, and muttered that he had asked for a quiet evening. Then the signal was given, and the sand erupted in chaos. The blade dancer struck first, moving in a blur, her knives flashing like shards of moonlight. To the crowd, it was as if she vanished and reappeared behind him, but Reaper moved with deceptive slowness, tilting his head just enough that her blades passed harmlessly. He gave her a look that said he had seen that trick 1,000 times, and she hesitated, doubt creeping into her perfect rhythm. The cyborg opened fire, the cannon on his back spitting molten rounds that carved trenches into the sand. Reaper dove rolled, and came up beside one of the broken pillars that jutted from the arena floor. The pillar crumbled under the fire, but it gave him cover long enough to survey. The predator circled him, snarling, its skin flickering with colors to confuse the eye. The crowd gasped, waiting for blood. Reaper exhaled slowly, muttered that he missed fighting men instead of circus acts, and then made his move. His cybernetic eye pulsed once, scanning the field. In that flash of light, he saw weaknesses laid bare. The dancer's enhancers overloaded if pushed too long. The cyborg's cannon overheated if held on full fire. The predator's skin camouflage faltered when it lunged. Weaknesses were puzzles, and Reaper had always loved puzzles. The fight stretched on, each clash shaking the arena, each dodge and strike painting a clearer picture. Reaper fought not just with his fists and his eye but with his wit. He taunted them, called the cyborg a walking toaster, mocked the dancer's timing, called the predator a cat that needed declawing. The crowd laughed despite themselves, tension breaking under his dry humor. But humor was the mask he wore as he dismantled each of them, piece by piece. The dancer collapsed when her reflexes stuttered, her speed turned into a stumbling mess. The cyborg's cannon jammed, his bulk turning him into a slow-moving target. The predator lunged, its camouflage flickering, and Reaper caught it midair, driving it into the sand with a crack that silenced the crowd. When the dust settled, Reaper stood again, bloodied but breathing, while his opponents lay broken around him. The arena thundered with applause, fear, and awe. The master clapped slowly from his throne, his silver mask hiding whether he smiled in victory or trembled in dread. Reaper looked up, his chest rising and falling, and his eye glowed brighter than before. He had not fought to win wagers. He had fought because he had no choice. But the galaxy did not see it that way. To them, Reaper had returned, not as a man but as a force. His survival meant fortunes gained or lost, borders redrawn, fleets unleashed. He sighed, shaking his head. They would never understand. They thought the arena had proven he was still a weapon. What they did not realize was that the weapon had just remembered he had teeth. The arena had become less a stage for blood sport and more a theater of politics. Reaper felt it in the way the crowds no longer laughed at spilled blood but leaned forward with nervous anticipation, measuring every strike as if it carried the weight of entire star systems. Whispers spread through the corridors, whispers of factions aligning their bets, whispers of assassins being hired, whispers of governments debating whether to acknowledge or silence the resurrection of a man they had once buried. Reaper had wanted nothing more than a quiet exile. Now his existence had become currency, traded in smoke-filled rooms where power was carved into shares. He sat in the shadows of his cell, listening to the muffled roar above, rubbing his temples and muttering that the galaxy was just as stupid as it had always been. It was in that moment of solitude that the boy came to him, though boy was hardly the right word. He was barely out of his teens, hair messy, eyes too bright with ambition to belong in a place built on despair. He introduced himself with a name that Reaper immediately forgot, because it was not the name that mattered but the fire behind it. The youth had slipped through guards with more courage than sense, eager to stand in the presence of a man he had idolized from stories passed down like forbidden treasures. He declared he wanted to fight alongside Reaper, to learn, to carry the torch of a legend. Reaper looked at him for a long time, his good eye tired, his cybernetic one glowing faintly. Then he told the boy to go back home, marry someone nice, and never step foot in an arena again. The boy refused. He said he would follow Reaper whether the old man wanted him there or not. Reaper sighed and muttered something about idiots being a galactic constant. By the next match, the boy was there in the shadows of the preparation chamber, sharpening a blade far too heavy for his arms. Reaper watched him fumble, correcting his grip with a gruff word here and a mocking laugh there. He did not want the role of mentor, but the boy's persistence carved a place beside him. They spoke little, but when they did, it was always in barbs. The boy called him old and slow. Reaper called him green and doomed. Somewhere in the middle of that insult trading, a bond began to form. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the start of something more dangerous. The old man had spent years avoiding attachments, and here came this reckless youth, reminding him of a time when he too had been foolish enough to believe in heroes. The fights that followed tested more than just strength. Strange accidents began to occur. Weapons jammed in ways too perfect to be chance. Traps appeared in corridors that only someone with knowledge of the arena's layouts could have set. One night, a support beam collapsed near Reaper's cell, nearly crushing him in his sleep. He woke coughing through the dust, his eye glowing red in the dark, and he knew immediately this was not bad luck. Someone was moving pieces against him, someone close enough to the arena master's staff to slip poison into water and sabotage into steel. He had not survived wars by ignoring patterns, and the pattern here stank of betrayal. The boy saw it too, though his outrage came with the fire of youth rather than the calculation of a veteran. He swore he would find the traitor, swore he would expose whoever dared strike at Reaper from the shadows. Reaper told him not to bother, that the galaxy would betray you as easily as it fed you, that betrayal was a constant as sure as gravity. Still, he let the boy dig, because every legend needs someone to carry their echoes, and every old wolf knows when it is time to let a pup sniff the air. The truth came to light in a way neither expected. It was after a brutal match against an assassin armed with sonic blades, when Reaper returned to his chamber bleeding but victorious. The boy stumbled in behind him, his own blade stained with the assassin's blood from where he had intervened clumsily in the fight. They both collapsed in exhaustion, laughing through their wounds. Then the door slid open, and one of the arena handlers stepped inside, thinking them too tired to notice. The man carried a vial, the same kind used to taint food, the same smell as the poisoned rations Reaper had spat out days before. The boy saw it first. He moved too quickly, too loudly, and the handler's knife was already in his hand. Reaper caught the attack mid-swing, his fingers closing around the man's wrist like a vice. The knife clattered to the floor. The boy looked on in shock as Reaper twisted, bones snapping like twigs. The handler screamed, confessed under the pressure of fear. He had been paid by one of the factions, ordered to make Reaper die in the sand so the wagers would fall where they were supposed to. The master had looked the other way, happy to profit from any outcome. It was a game to them, a game of blood and lies. To Reaper, it was an insult. He let the handler live, not out of mercy but because fear was more useful than death. The boy wanted him executed, but Reaper only shook his head. Better to let the man carry his terror back to the ones who had bought him. Better to let the factions know that Reaper was not a piece on their board but a hand that could scatter it at will. The boy argued, his voice rising, until Reaper silenced him with a glare that carried the weight of decades. The galaxy had played its trick, but Reaper was the one who had taught the galaxy its tricks in the first place. From that day, whispers spread that the old man was not merely surviving the arena but bending it. Every sabotage that failed, every plot that crumbled, added to his legend. The boy followed him everywhere now, eager, reckless, certain he was part of something larger than himself. Reaper tolerated it, even as he cursed under his breath. He did not want a partner. He did not want a student. But fate had a cruel sense of humor, and so the boy remained, a reminder that legacy was something you could not outrun. The arena continued to feed on blood, but the air had shifted. The crowd no longer saw an old relic fighting for scraps. They saw alliances forming in the sand, betrayals cracking through the walls, and an old wolf teaching a pup how to bare his teeth. Every match became more than entertainment. Every glance from Reaper's glowing eye was a promise that the galaxy's games would not go unanswered. The boy cheered at his side, loud enough for the crowd to hear, and in that noise the legend grew louder still. Somewhere beyond the stars, factions plotted and schemed, but Reaper smiled thinly, knowing the game was already turning against them. The arena was no longer an arena. It had become a proving ground for power, a stage upon which entire empires gambled their futures. Reaper could feel it in the way the crowds pressed tighter against the barriers, their shouts laced with fear as much as awe. The wagers had shifted. No longer were they betting on blood spilled for entertainment. They were betting on the survival of governments, on the collapse of rivals, on whether one old man could defy death one more time. The boy walked beside him into the preparation chambers, his steps quick with nervous energy. He asked if Reaper ever got scared. The old man glanced at him, his face cracked with scars and time, and answered that fear was like a knife. You only cut yourself if you hold it wrong. The boy did not laugh. He was beginning to understand the weight of what they were walking into. When the gates opened, the air carried a different kind of tension. This was no simple match. The masters of the arena had unleashed what they called the gauntlet, a sequence of battles designed not to test strength but to ensure death. Reaper stepped onto the sand and was greeted by a towering mech, its frame bristling with missile pods, its steps sinking deep into the dirt. The crowd gasped, some cheering, others murmuring that no flesh and blood could withstand such a monster. Reaper exhaled through his nose, muttered that he had seen bigger machines crash into asteroids, and then rolled his shoulders as if preparing for a stroll. The boy watched from the shadows of the entrance, fists clenched, desperate to rush forward but forced to obey Reaper's earlier command to stay back until needed. The mech opened fire, missiles streaking across the sand. Explosions threw clouds of dust high into the air, the ground trembling underfoot. Reaper darted between the blasts, slower than he once had been but precise enough that the missiles always landed a step behind him. His cybernetic eye scanned the machine, lines of data painting weaknesses invisible to the crowd. He saw the gaps in the armor where hydraulics were exposed, the glow of an overheating reactor behind the chest plating. He did not attack head-on. He never had. Instead, he used the debris, ducking behind shattered columns, letting the mech's weapons carve its own traps. With each volley, the machine grew more desperate, and in its desperation, it exposed itself. Reaper leapt from cover, sliding across the sand, and drove a scavenged blade into one of the joints. Sparks erupted. The machine staggered, weapons firing wildly. With a final pulse of energy from his eye, Reaper overloaded its targeting systems. The mech twisted, fired a missile directly into its own chest, and collapsed in a roar of fire. The crowd erupted, the boy shouting with unrestrained joy, but Reaper only muttered that the engineers who built it should ask for refunds. The gauntlet was only beginning. Before the flames had cooled, the next opponent entered. A pack of genetically engineered hounds, their bodies stretched long, jaws filled with metal teeth, eyes glowing blue with synthetic rage. They circled him, growling low, their claws leaving scars in the sand. Reaper stood still, waiting, the way a man waits for a storm to break. When the first lunged, he moved with sudden violence, seizing its throat and using its momentum to swing it into another. The crowd screamed as bones cracked. The hounds swarmed, but Reaper's movements were sharp, efficient, never wasted. He fought them the way he had flown in the Orion Wars, weaving through chaos, striking at the perfect angle, never giving his enemies the rhythm they sought. When the last hound lay twitching in the dirt, Reaper spat blood and said he preferred fighting men who at least screamed words before dying. The third round was different. This time, a challenger walked out not in steel or fur but in flesh, a woman dressed in ceremonial armor, her face painted with markings of a warrior tribe from the far reaches of the galaxy. She carried no weapon but a staff of bone, and her eyes locked on Reaper with something more than hatred. She spoke words only he could hear over the roar of the crowd. She had lost brothers in the Orion Wars, men killed by his hand. She had waited for the day to face him. Reaper's face softened for the first time. He told her the war had taken from him too, that she was chasing vengeance against a man who had buried his own ghosts 100 times over. But vengeance does not listen. She attacked with fury, her staff spinning, each strike powerful enough to break ribs. Reaper parried, dodged, never striking to kill. He moved with respect, with regret, but he knew how this fight would end. The crowd demanded blood, and the arena master would not accept mercy. When she overextended, he disarmed her with a twist and drove her into the sand, pinning her throat with the weight of his knee. She looked up, eyes burning, and for a moment, he considered letting her win. But mercy here was cruelty, and so he pressed down until her breath was gone. When he stood, his face was heavy with something darker than victory. By the time the fourth wave arrived, the boy could no longer stay in the shadows. The arena gates burst open, and a swarm of armored drones poured out, their weapons synchronized, their targeting locked on to Reaper. He fought them, tearing one apart to use its arm as a shield, but even he could not keep pace forever. His cybernetic eye flickered, its glow dimming, and pain lanced across his skull. The eye was failing. He staggered, blood dripping from his temple. The drones closed in. The boy broke his promise, sprinting into the sand with a scream. He swung his blade wildly, clumsy but defiant, drawing the fire of half the machines. Reaper roared in fury, not at the drones but at the boy, cursing him for his recklessness. Yet together they carved a path, the boy's raw energy buying moments for Reaper to regain his footing. In the chaos, the old man saw opportunity. He redirected his eyes' failing energy into one final pulse, overloading the drones. They fell one by one, collapsing into smoking heaps. The crowd was louder than it had ever been, but the roar was drowned by something else. The sky itself seemed to tremble. Alarms blared across the arena. Reaper looked up and saw the truth. The factions had grown impatient. They had realized no opponent would finish him, no beast or machine would break him. And so they had turned to annihilation. From above, orbital cannons aligned, their beams charging to reduce the entire arena to ash. The master panicked in his throne, shouting orders, but the decision had been made far beyond him. Reaper grabbed the boy by the collar, dragging him toward cover as shadows of death grew across the sand. He spat in the dirt, muttering that the galaxy had always been predictable. If they could not kill him with knives and claws, they would burn the world beneath his feet. The crowd screamed as the sky split with fire, and Reaper knew this was no longer about survival in an arena. This was survival against the galaxy itself. The air turned white with heat as the orbital cannons fired. The ground shook, sand bursting into glass, screams echoing through the stands as the audience realized they were no longer spectators but collateral. Reaper dragged the boy into the shadow of a collapsed pillar, the blast wave tearing past them like the breath of a dying god. The arena master shrieked from his throne, his silver mask reflecting the flames as his empire crumbled around him. This was no longer a wager or a show. This was a massacre ordered by hands far above, hands desperate to erase a ghost before he became something more dangerous than legend. Reaper spat blood and dust, muttering that he had never been much for retirement anyway. The boy coughed beside him, eyes wide, terror wrestling with the stubborn fire that had kept him alive this long. He shouted that they had to run, had to escape, but Reaper only shook his head. Running was pointless. The orbital cannons would level everything, every street, every escape tunnel. Survival meant turning their weapons against them. He looked up at the glowing lines in the sky, at the precision beams of death that lanced downward, and his cybernetic eye pulsed weakly, struggling to stay lit. He grinned despite the blood on his teeth. If the factions wanted him erased so badly, then perhaps he would give them their erasure, but not in the way they intended. Through the chaos, Reaper moved with a clarity born of decades in war. He pulled the boy toward the arena's core, where the master's control systems lay hidden beneath layers of steel and circuitry. Guards scattered or burned, some too foolish to realize the fight was no longer about prisoners or champions but about survival itself. Reaper smashed through locked gates, the boy at his heels, until they reached the control room. The master cowered there, his mask cracked, shouting at unseen handlers through broken comms. When Reaper entered, the man tried to bargain, tried to explain that this was beyond his power, that he too was just a pawn. Reaper grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the console, his voice low and steady. Pawns do not matter when the board is already burning. Then he threw the man aside and studied the controls with the eye of someone who had sabotaged warships larger than cities. The cannons above powered themselves through a synchronization link. The eye could not hold much longer, but it held enough. Reaper pressed his palm against the console, channeling the last surge of energy from his implant. His vision blurred, his skull felt like it was splitting apart, but he forced the pulse outward, hijacking the targeting systems of the orbital weapons. The boy shouted at him to stop, afraid the strain would kill him, but Reaper only laughed. Death was a companion he had long since grown used to. If he could use it one more time as a weapon, then so be it. The consoles screamed with alarms as the orbital cannons shifted, their beams no longer pointed at the arena but at the fleets waiting in orbit, the fleets of the factions who had ordered his death. A second later, the sky burned brighter than ever as their own weapons turned on them. Ships cracked like eggshells, fire spilling into the void, the factions' power crumbling in a blaze they had ignited themselves. The arena shook as debris rained from above, but within the chaos there was silence too. The boy looked at him in awe and horror. Reaper slumped against the console, smoke curling from the socket of his cybernetic eye. He muttered that it had been a good trick, maybe his last. The boy refused to accept it, pulling him to his feet, insisting they could still escape. Reaper coughed, laughed, and told him not to waste breath on old bones. Yet the boy dragged him anyway, hauling him through collapsing corridors as fire and dust devoured the walls. Together they stumbled out into the streets beyond the arena, where panic reigned and the galaxy's vultures tore each other apart in the skies above. By dawn, the arena was nothing but ash and twisted steel. The orbital cannons had fallen silent, their fleets destroyed, their masters dead or fleeing. Word spread faster than fire through dry fields. Reaper had not only survived but had turned the weapons of empires back on themselves. Some whispered he was a demon, others a savior, but all agreed on one thing. The galaxy would never be the same again. His legend had grown, no longer confined to forgotten war stories but reborn in the ashes of betrayal and massacre. The boy stood beside him on the outskirts of the ruins, his face blackened with soot, his blade chipped and broken. He asked what came next, his voice trembling with exhaustion and something that sounded like hope. Reaper looked out at the rising sun, his one good eye heavy, the socket of his ruined implant still smoking faintly. He said the galaxy would keep playing its games, and fools would keep bleeding for them, but that did not mean the game could not be rigged. The boy asked if that meant they would keep fighting together. Reaper chuckled, dry and tired, and told him not to get ideas. He had already retired twice, maybe 3 times now. The boy laughed despite himself, and the sound carried strangely pure in the ruins. As the day grew brighter, scavengers came to pick through the wreckage, survivors staggered out from the shadows, and whispers spread of a young fighter who had stood beside the Reaper when the sky itself tried to kill him. The boy's story was already growing, already twisting into legend, and Reaper could see it happening. Legacy had found a new vessel. He hated it, but he also knew it was inevitable. The galaxy always needed myths to chew on, and it seemed the boy was next in line. When the noise of rebuilding began, Reaper slipped away. He left without a word, without farewell, vanishing into the dust and smoke. The boy searched for him but found only the black patch lying in the sand, scorched at the edges but intact. He picked it up, holding it tightly, knowing what it meant. Reaper had walked away again, choosing the shadows over the spotlight. Perhaps he was dead this time. Perhaps he was not. But the galaxy would never be sure. That uncertainty was more powerful than any weapon. In taverns and war rooms, across colonies and fleets, the whispers began anew. They said the Reaper had destroyed empires with a glance. They said he had turned death itself against his enemies. They said he could not be killed, only hidden. And somewhere, far from the ashes, an old man limped through the wastes, smoke still curling faintly from beneath his ruined eye. He pulled the patch back over the socket, adjusted it, and smiled to himself. Retirement, he muttered, for the 3rd time. The galaxy could believe whatever it wanted. Let them chase ghosts. He was still here, still walking, and still a step ahead of death.